Hello, guys. Welcome to this special webinar we're doing here with Andrew Cooper, very close friend of mine here, head of sales of Global E-commerce Experts. So today is going to be an amazing, actually, webinar. Even for me, we're going to be talking about very interesting topic, which is compliance. I mean, compliance is something that we know is similar to taxes. It's very complex sometimes. Sometimes it can get all over the head, but at the same time, it's super important when it comes to international expansion. And I know our guys here at Global E-commerce Expert are the top guys in the space when it comes to that. And that's why I wanted to bring Andrew today, because he has a lot of knowledge when it comes to this. And lately, which that's actually something, having this conversation before going live with the webinar, a lot of people now consider more than ever going to Europe, especially brands from the US. Like, we're having this competitive environment. Let's be honest, in the US, it's getting more competitive than ever, and people is looking Europe as a second opportunity. So now that that's the case, at the same time, you need to be compliant with all the rules, and that's what we're basically going to be touching on today. But before we jump into all of that, I want to give you first a few minutes, Andrew, to introduce yourself, and then, of course, to get started with the webinar. Yeah?
Sure. Absolutely. Vincenzo, always a pleasure. Thank you for having us on. It's always good to chat. Hopefully give over some knowledge and educational pieces. And today, as you mentioned, is compliance, everyone's favorite subject. Everyone loves talking about it.
More than PPC.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking specifically about label and product compliance, the sort of first stage, as it were, for when you're thinking about expanding your brand internationally, is understanding if it can be sold. So we'll dive into that in a minute. But yeah, a little bit about me, Andrew Cooper. I've sort of adopted the Drew name over the past sort of 12 months, as we've got a few Andrews here. And I'm often getting confused, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively, but call me what you like. But I've been with Global E-commerce Experts now for coming up to 3 odd years, and we've successfully helped multiple brands expand into Europe. So that's currently what we're doing, and we're on a mission to continue that journey. So yeah, glad to be here. Thank you as ever, and looking forward to it.
Pleasure, Andrew. Thank you for being here. So yeah, I mean, today's topic, as we say, is going to be very interesting because, even for myself, I feel like there is a lot of moving parts when it comes to compliance. I mean, we're talking that it's not only to do with the actual labeling, but it's also things to do with, for example, the responsible person in Europe, which is something we're going to be talking today. That's also a very interesting topic. And also the compliance itself when it comes to even sometimes there's translation when it comes to these labels, because different countries, when it comes to Europe specifically, different languages. So that's also something most likely people are going to have questions about how to navigate. But I guess with the first question for you, when it comes to a brand that is coming from the US, like, I know you're going to be doing a presentation, but just to set the ground, like, when do you think is the right moment to start thinking about compliance in the first place? And then I'm going to start putting your presentation on the screen, because I think, like, I feel a lot of people do the expansion and then they realize they have to do the compliance, and then they get stuck in the process. So I will say, how many months in advance maybe you will say this is a conversation you need to start having when it comes to expansion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the product compliance piece, imperative that it happens very early on. So, if you're thinking about expanding, or you've been recommended, or you've got some support from Amazon as an example to do it, make that your first step. Now, I'll come on to sort of the process a bit later, but the earlier you do this, the better, because it does one of two things. One, it understands whether your product can be sold or not. Now, that's the key bit here, because if you have some label compliance completed by a company and then you find out that the product can't be sold, then potentially you could have gone through a lot more cost, used a lot more energy, absorbed a lot more resource in taking your product to market, to then understand that it's got an ingredient in it that you're not allowed to sell in the UK. And by extracting that ingredient makes your product not what you've designed or you're branding it for.
Exactly.
So then you have to stop the whole thing altogether. So definitely do this as early as possible. Get it done, understand, learn from it, and then you can then adopt those changes and that knowledge that you've gained across your other product categories if you've got them. The second piece to that is to make sure that you're not going to go through, a rebranding, or you're not going to, go through the manufacturing stage of your packaging before you need changes to be made, because you had an extra course, you had an extra resource to do that. By doing this, you can often, make amendments or removals from your packaging to be okay in multiple countries. So you don't have to have, packaging for the US and packaging for, UAE and packaging for Europe.
Exactly.
You can often make it so that, you can use one or maybe two packaging options for your international expansion.
Awesome.
As early as possible. It's a very short answer.
Very good. Yeah, and that's an amazing insight, because I think what you just described right there is, you don't know how many times I have a call with a client that they went through all the process of manufacturing, product design and everything, and they say, oh, I'm ready to go to the UK, I'm ready to go to Italy, and they say, okay guys, but everything you did on the packaging and compliance is wrong, like we need to go back to the drawing board. And yes, I agree, like the earliest you can do it, the better, for sure. So I guess now you're gonna do. I can see the presentation here on the screen. We're gonna go through all the insights you're gonna be sharing with us. So yeah, please
sure.
feel free to get started. Yeah.
So thank you. So, I mean, it's a short presentation. I've tried to pick out some key bits here, which are going to be maybe familiar to people. There's going to be some terminology in here which I can explain, but people are likely to have heard of, and therefore, it's going to be familiar, and they're going to be, to understand it in a way that makes sense for Europe. So this sort of is I'm backtracking a little bit. So this first slide is about what is product compliance. What does it mean? Why do you have to do it, really, I suppose? Now, essentially, it's several things. One is to ensure that your label is compliant. So to make sure that your packaging of your product is appropriately labeled for the market in which you're going to move into. So you haven't got anything on there that's deemed, inappropriate or against regulations. No. That's the key bit here. And then you're talking about, you're then going to need things like, depends on your product category, you're going to need registrations. If you've got a medical device, you're going to need to register that. If you've got, a cosmetic product, you're going to need to have a product information file audited, and then you're going to need to register that product on some regulatory bodies throughout Europe. But in its simplest form, it's really about making sure that your product can be sold in multiple countries in Europe by making the minimal amount of changes or additions or removals to that label, and make it as easy as possible for the brand owner to enter multiple markets with ease and without significant cost, and without changing the aesthetics of their product packaging. That's super important here. When I'm speaking to people, quite often one of the first questions will be, but I don't want to change my packaging. I like it. I don't want to have to, take down a logo, and I don't want to have to move stuff around because I spent so long, crafting this. And it's not, and that is 99.9% of the time, it's not required. This is small changes in the main, or small additions to it, in order to satisfy the US in particular, that's our main client base, and UK and European regulations. So it's not about necessarily making lots of changes. This is a simple step, as it were, to lots of different terminology and lots of buzzwords, and makes people think that there's lots of stuff to do. But essentially, it's making it compliant for the UK and Europe.
Nice. I guess one question most likely people may have regarding this is, when it comes to the compliance, I know we refer Europe as a whole, but would you say some of these specific requirements you're showing here on the screen may vary depending on the country, or there are specific scenarios where one of them could be valid across the whole European Union? Like, how does it work in that perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So since it keeps rearing its head, it doesn't help Brexit, but since we made the right hash of leaving the European Union, it means that a lot of these bits on here, so we'll take a couple of these as an example. So medical registration, you need to do that in the UK and in Europe. Okay. So, but because obviously Europe's still one unit, and you can just make one registration in Europe, and it'll be satisfactory for all of the countries in the pan-EU. And the same goes for all of these, actually, that, the CPMP portal, you have a cosmetic product notification portal for Europe, and then you have one. Oh, actually, you have one for the UK, but for the UK piece as well. So they're separate, but they're not arduous. They're not country specific in the main. And we could go right down a rabbit hole and start talking about some really complex products, but generally they're not seen in this space anyway, where there's different regulations required per country, but very, very rare. This is the most basic and normal form that nine times out of 10, these are the areas where people would need to be involved.
Very good, very good. And also you mentioned there's something very interesting, which I have seen a lot actually in products lately, which is the fact that you're right, like the packaging doesn't have to be customized a lot. In fact, I have seen a lot lately, like people, rather than printing a new packaging, they just put a sticker on top sometimes of the packaging and stuff like that, right? Like that could be a easy fix as well, right? It's not very expensive.
And it's actually a recommendation of ours. When you're launching, of course, you're going to be making a heavy investment in making sure your products are fit for sale and getting VAT registered and all of that jazz. Then you're going to make an even more significant investment in purchasing stock to send halfway around the world generally. So what we recommend when we're talking to people about product label compliance is make your first shipment or your first 2 or 3 shipments as easy as possible by doing exactly that, Vincenzo. Use an over sticker, use an insert, use something where you're not going to have to then rerun your packaging, and you're not going to have to get somebody in your domestic country to repackage all your goods. We definitely don't recommend doing that in the early stages unless you're expanding with a significant amount of stock and all back in, and you've got this extravagant expansion plan to start with. Definitely take the easy steps first and foremost.
Awesome. Great. So I guess in terms of another question, sorry, I just want to make sure we clarify that as well. Like, is there a specific order you will go about attacking regulations? So it's like, is there a specific regulation you need to attack before or wants to in the sense of criteria, like are there compliance that you need to tick one box to get to the next compliance, or you can work on all of them regardless of your status? So
if I just swing back to that slide quick. So obviously all of these, this is just a sample of the regulations that are appropriate to some products. They're not all appropriate to all products. So in answer to your question, dependent on the complexity of the product you're selling, and when I say complexity, I mean, is it a higher risk product or is it just a general product? If you're talking about a coaster that you put a glass on, to stop the table getting wet, that's going to be a general product. So in which case you need a label review, and then you need an address on your label, and then you don't need to register it anywhere. You don't need to, the likelihood of making any real amendments to your label is slim, and then you get a UK or European address, and you can start selling it. If you've got if you're trying to register a medicine, something that, that's of course far more complex, and there's a lot of maybe additional testing that need to be required in order to do that. So yes, there's steps in that instance.
Nice.
But again, if we're talking about medicines and we're going down that medicinal route as an example, or we're registering a medical device, then the brand would have gone through similar registrations and similar testing in their domestic country anyway. So it's unlike when we get to those sorts of product categories, the clients are generally familiar with what that looks like, because I don't know of any country where you can just start selling a medicine freely on the open market without having to at least get it tested. So but most of these registrations or compliance pieces are one-off, and they come off the back of having a compliant label.
Exact. Okay, good. Very good. Thank
you. Excuse me. And I just wanted to, we sort of spoke about this a little bit, but I wanted to touch on what is a label review. There's sometimes some questions surrounding the product label review. Are you testing my product? Are you taking my product into a laboratory and then conducting the tests that I've already had done multiple times in my domestic country? The answer is no. This isn't about the product itself. What's going on your label is the piece of work as the brand owner that they know far more about than anybody else, because they've created this product. They've gone through the makeup and entered the ingredients to make it fit for, you know, what they're trying to achieve with their brand. They know that. They then transpose that information onto a label, of course, to then educate the end user and satisfy the regulations and all that jazz. But what they're printing on their label is what a label reviewer is looking for. So we're not going to question what's in there. We're not going to question, you know, that shouldn't be in there unless it's an ingredient that can't be sold, of course, because that's the idea of it. But the actual makeup of the product itself and, you know, what material it's made out of, we're not looking for that. We're just making sure that what you're using in it, on it, with it is okay for sale, you know, without any boundaries. So we're looking for things like, you know, specific ingredients in there that are on maybe on the novel food list in the UK and Europe, which means that they can't be sold. We're looking for specific claims or wording that's, you know, deems it, puts it into a different category, you know. Just to give you an example of that, if we're talking about, you know, a face cream, there's an example, cosmetic face cream, and we're saying, you know, reduces the appearance of wrinkles. Yeah.
Okay.
That be maybe deemed as a cosmetic product. If that said removes wrinkles, then saying the same thing, put it into another level, which is then, well, is it a medicine? Is it so it's making sure that it's appropriate. And quite often, you know, we'll obviously suggest to the client of maybe rewording them if it puts them into that category. So that's where the support piece comes in to say, look, you can't have that because, or you can have it, but then you're going to need to go down this route in order to register it as a medicine. If you choose to use this wording, then it will remain a cosmetic or it will remain a general product. And then subsequently, you know, you can sell it without, you know, going down any more arduous routes. And we're then looking for specific terminology on what category it fits in, and then any formulas that are made in it, and if there's any markings that are required. So, I mean, the UK and EU way they're changing or their focus on regulations at the minute and deciding when to put stuff on and when not to put stuff on changes like the wind. So things like the UK CA mark came out of Brexit. Okay, well now we're a standalone country and we want to have recognised as having a UK CA mark instead of a CE mark, which is the same standard, by the way. But we want the UK CA, like, and then so they say, right, anyone who's now entering Europe by January 2024 is going to need a UK CA as well as the CE mark. Now they've scrapped that all together, and there's no intention of, or they haven't been given a date when they're going to relaunch that. Things like that, where, you know, we'll support the client and educate on what they do and don't need on their labels, images, recycling images, all that sort of stuff. And then we'll provide a report which will detail all of that information and put them in a position where, should they make those adjustments, then their products can be freely sold on the European market.
Very good. You mentioned there's something very interesting, which is actually makes sense. The fact that, you know, unfortunately, as we stand, like, especially after Brexit, things are moving very fast here in the UK. And my questions to you is basically when it comes to labeling, for example, and compliance, will you say then that as we stand right now, at least in the UK, this is something that then you need to check on a monthly basis to see if you're still compliant? Because it seems like it could be that if you're doing something today, maybe in 2 months, you're not compliant anymore. You need to go back to the drawing board, change the packaging. So have you seen that happening a lot lately with the?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's not fortunately, they don't change things. They don't change things a lot. What they tend to do is either say, we're going to do that, and then don't do it, or keep pushing it back. Or they will add stuff. So they'll, you know, as an example of that, like the novel food list, you know, they'll add on a new ingredient that some labs tested and deemed it not appropriate. So sometimes they'll make those amendments. But there's something called a declaration of conformity. And again, without going into too much detail, people are more than welcome to reach out to me if any of these words you know, interesting and they want to find out more, no problems with that. But the declaration of conformity is the CE, you know, rubber stamp from a client's perspective that they conform to the European regulation. So as part of the process, the client will have to make that declaration and say, well, my product now conforms. But what that isn't is is okay, I can now sell it for the next 15 years and
exactly.
it'll be absolutely okay. Because this is about when those changes come out that you're mentioning, that they keep up to date with them, which I'll come back to in a minute, and make sure that if there is anything that's appropriate to their product, that they make those adjustments or removals or additions as and when they come about. Now, part of the prerequisite of the label review is a responsible person, which we'll touch on in a minute, which is once you've got a compliant label, then having somebody in the UK and Europe to help you. Part of our obligation as a responsible person from conducting the label review and then representing the client is that we update you on all of those changes. So I know it's quite a long-winded way of answering your question, Vincenzo, but yes, they do need to, but will they have somebody to support them with it? Yes, they will, which is essentially us.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So this is just a quick illustration, really, of like how it happens and what the process is from a compliance perspective. Excuse me, in order to make their goods compliant. We've sort of touched on this, so I'll make this slide pretty snappy because it gives a couple of examples on there of the wording and stuff that you can't do, and that's really critical. Is that often what we find, particularly from our US clients, are fortunately for the client that the regulations in the US tend to be a little bit more relaxed than the UK and Europe, which is fantastic from a sales perspective and the ability to be able to move goods through the US. But when they come to the UK, there's often some some words on there which we need to change, and that's what we'll be looking for specifically. We'll be looking for those to be positively and manipulated to be able to sell in both regions. And again, I'll repeat myself from earlier a bit, but we're not talking here about having two separate labels necessarily. We're talking about having one unified label for access to 750 million more people without having to make significant changes to your label.
Interesting. And I guess just to make a quick parenthesis here, it could be then if you're more in like supplements and things are more delicate, then potentially you will need to change even the formulation in some instances just to comply with Europe. And you may have two different products in terms of formulation when it comes to the US and Europe. That could happen as well, right?
Yes, it could. Yeah. And I think, as it's really, really prominent that we're having this discussion about compliance at the moment, because there's a lot of stuff happening specifically in Amazon as well about making sure that there's a clamp down as well on products. And it is getting more, even over the past 2 years, it's got more important to ensure that things like ingredients are appropriate. So yes, there is from time to time, then the formulation will have to be amended. Fortunately, it's not super common. The most common amendment that needs to be made is, in fact, the reduction of it. Things that I'm trying to think from my head of an example of it, but I can't.
I think to do with sugar. I know sometimes the sugar control and things like that.
Yes.
I heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, if they've got an ingredient, there's limits. There's safe upper limits in the Europe, which may be slightly different to another country. In which case, you need to reduce that in order to sell it. Which, providing it doesn't, conflict with what the client's trying to achieve by selling their product, generally it doesn't really matter. Overall.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Awesome.
And then your point here, Vincenzo, you mentioned earlier about the translations. And there's a bit of a myth buster here. So a common misconception of translations is that, okay, well, I'm currently selling in Canada and I want to move my product into Europe. And there's like 8-10 countries in Europe and they all speak different languages. This is going to be an absolute nightmare. I'm selling a little bottle, of this spray on thing there. How on earth am I going to fit 8 languages on there? Like, it's just, this is crazy. I can't, I haven't got the ability to be able to manufacture, or, recreate 8 different labels and label 8 different products. But the answer to this is you only need to translate your label into the countries where you're storing goods. That's the first and foremost area here. So if you're looking to put them in a German FBA as an example and use a 3PL in Germany, and then you want to distribute your goods from Germany D2C to the rest of Europe, you can just have them translated into German.
Interesting.
if you want to sell on, pan-EU within Amazon as an example, then you're going to have translations in all of those countries. Okay. It's really important to note that it's not your label in its entirety in most cases. It depends on product category, but quite often you can just have the key things translated: ingredients, claims, instructions for use. You don't need to start going down having, and again, changing the aesthetics of your product and making it, non-saleable from your perspective. You can just change the key areas and then do it either by using a peel and reveal label, super common in Europe.
What QR code maybe? Could you use like a QR code maybe, or is that not allowed, like a QR code?
So that's a really great question. So QR code, yes, for some information, but it's not recognized throughout Europe yet as being satisfactory for the compliance areas. But I honestly don't think that's far away. I think we're well behind the times. If we're saying, which we are, that it's not satisfactory for all the information. I mean, who doesn't have a phone with a camera now, right?
Exactly. Everything's a QR code now. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you're more likely to use that than you are peel out a bit of paper from the box and read it. So
exactly.
But knows the answer. But yeah, peel and reveal label, super common. An insert, super common. Cost-effective way of doing it. You can get multiple languages on it.
Exactly.
Or you can, if you've got a product which has got a big enough packaging, have several languages on the back. And it's generally on the back. I'll keep referring to that. It's generally on the back or inside. And then depending on your product category is what needs to be translated.
Awesome. Very good.
And then, so the responsible person, quite a heavy slide here with lots of information on it. But essentially, so once you've got a compliant product, you then need somebody in the region to represent you as a responsible person. At the very least, you'll need a UK or EU address on the label. Now, again, dependent on the product category, there's different terminology for this. So, for CE mark products, the correct terminology is responsible person. If you've got a food supplement, it's a food business operator or an authorized representative. They essentially mean the same thing, which is somebody in the region that's responsible, jointly responsible for the compliance of your product. So the process here would be get a compliant product, have a label review done, instruct someone to be your responsible person who knows what they're doing. That's a really key bit here. Once you've got them two pieces, then you'd need to print that address on your packaging for your responsible person, and then you can start selling it. That's the product compliance piece essentially done. And what that responsible person is somebody to support you with the updates that we mentioned earlier, Vincenzo. If there's anything that you need to know about, regulation changes, safe upper limit levels decreased or increased quite often, or there's some heavy product recalls on a type of product. They will reach out and let you know about those changes, and then we support to make them essentially. The second piece to it is if the regulators or governing bodies want to see the product because it's very rare that happens, fortunately, but there have been multiple complaints about a product and they want to come and make sure that that it is what you say it is, then we would act on your behalf, or your responsible person. I keep referring to us, but of course there's multiple people who can support. But yeah, your responsible person will support you by dealing with that regulatory body to show them the product and also the accompanying documentation, which is what we would collect from you once we're representing you, and give that to the regulatory body and support them with that process. So I use the responsible person, although it's a necessity, you need it. I liken it to an insurance policy. All of the time that you're not using it, which is a good thing, by the way, all the time you're not using it, it's just sat there in the background and you've got a label on your product, but you're happily selling and it's all okay. The rare occasion that something would go wrong is when it's an absolute godsend. And for our clients who have experienced listings being pulled down, Amazon just wiping out their entire catalog because one of their products is deemed as non-compliant.
Exactly.
It's worth in order to get that reinstated, as you well know, Vincenzo, can just be a really difficult and arduous task sometimes. But being able to evidence to them quickly that
Is
the product's compliant. Yeah, like I've got a responsible person here. Like, what's the problem? And get the documentation to them quickly is just, you know, is super effective and super efficient with our clients.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something on this slide which I found very interesting, even for me, and that's why I knew I was going to learn something new here. That you mentioned UK sellers don't need a responsible person service because they have a UK address. So apparently that's a mistake. So can you give me more insights about that? What does it mean with that sentence, basically? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So what I mean by that is there's best way to explain. So there's a lot of companies out there who claiming to be a responsible person and just registering a UK business and you know, having a flat or a bed sitting
an address, whatever.
UK, and there's no, you know, nobody may even be living there, but it's a UK address, and selling the responsible person service extremely cheap, but you're satisfying, in inverted commas, you're satisfying the fact that you've got a UK address on your product. That piece is done, and that piece, you know, you could sell for a week before that gets caught up, or you could be selling for years. Like, it's one of those things that you see it on there. Yes, it's compliant. We move on. The problem is with that is that it's one, it's not an actual responsible person, and two, they're not knowledgeable and they don't have the education in order to support. But two, should anything go wrong, it's not a real place, you know. So what I don't mean that, you know, if you've got a legitimate registered business in the UK, of course, and you can represent yourself, so that piece is okay. This is about identifying when you're looking to expand into the UK and Europe, is using a reputable company who's actually got the ability to represent you, not just say they're going to do it, because they're polar opposite, two completely different things. And there's things like, you know, when we talk about the food business operator, which is the food supplement side of responsible person, you actually need to be registered for that. So if you're selling, you need to be a registered business and registered in order to operate as an FBO. So that's really about just understanding that cost isn't important here. You're paying for a really, really important service with your service provider of your choice. You're paying for a really important service that ensures that you have longevity in sales of your product.
Very good. And when it comes to getting basically and finding this responsible person, like you as an international seller, do you need to have some documentation in hand to be able to officially get this person on board with you and be your representative? Like, is there some checklist you have to go through so that person can officially give you the service as a responsible person?
Yeah. So I think so what, from the client's perspective?
Yeah, exactly. From the client's perspective. Yeah.
Yes, correct. So in its most basic form, what we need is manufacturing documentation. So if you're selling a general product and you'll have it manufactured in China, obviously they'll have a risk assessment and a manufacturing process for those goods. Yeah, from start to finish, they'll document what that process looks like. That's the piece of information that we require. That's a standard document, and that will be, unless somebody's manufacturing their product in, you know, in their
middle of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's you know, I mean, fair play if they are, but if they're doing that and there is no process for it, then that'd be really tricky for somebody to represent them, because there's no evidence of the process. But that's the most basic form. Then, dependent on product category, will be other documentation. So testing documentation, you know, for cosmetics, there's lots of cosmetic documentation. Ingredients, you know, we need various files for different things. So, but yeah, in the main, that document, and obviously the declaration of conformity, which is the CE marking piece. But that's not a standard document that you apply for, or you achieve. It's the client's confirmation that they're going to comply.
Okay, very good. And which, by the way, just to also mention to everybody now on the webinar, I can see a few people here on the webinar with us. Make sure that if you have any questions for Andrew, leave them on the chat so we can also towards the end answer those for you. Okay, awesome. Yeah, Andrew, thank you. You can continue.
Brilliant. Okay, and then we're coming towards the end of the slides here, so we'll be able to open up some questions if there is any. But we spoke about registrations, and one of the common questions I get is, I'm really worried about the testing of these documents if I am in Europe, and I'm worried about the registration of them. And I think it's because there is a misconception that I want to go international, I want to sell, elsewhere in the world, and I'm going to have to redo or do all of the stuff that I've already done, or I'm going to have to go through this whole myriad of testing of my product.
Huge headache.
Putting in labs and stuff like that, and that's really not the case. Often the testing that's already been done at manufacturing stage is appropriate. It's just making sure that, as I mentioned, the label is compliant. But if there are registrations that need to be done, there is very few. So you've got the cosmetic registrations and the cosmetic CPMP, a cosmetic product notification portal. They need to be registered because they're cosmetics, and obviously they're coming into contact with the skin. And then you have member state registrations in Europe for food supplements in some countries, not all. So outside of that, the only other thing would be medicines or medical devices, but of course they're slightly more tricky and a bit more specialist, and often the client's really well versed on what they need to do with those products because they would have done similar stuff before. But outside of those, 90% of products don't need any registration. Very rarely do they need any additional testing. It's simply going through to make sure that they can be sold. So I just wanted
to mention that, that's super important, the testing, because I also get a question a lot like, I cannot expand to Europe because I cannot afford paying again the labs to do the testing and everything. It's like, if you already did in the US, and most likely the labs you use in the US are accredited internationally, like you can revalidate the same test, like you don't need to do it again.
Absolutely. Totally. Very, very rare. And then this final is just for process. So really just to simplify it, I think that's a really critical thing. If people are looking to expand into Europe, as soon as you mention the word compliance, it's almost a headache, and people think it's going to take me weeks and months to do. The process for having a label review completed, we receive the label in a PDF format or similar document or similar file type. We then receive it, and we produce a review for the client. The maximum time frame for that is 3 weeks. The client then receives that report back, and then they make any changes if required. And then we receive that compliant label back again in a PDF or different similar file format. And we then collect the documentation and a compliant label, and we sign it off for a responsible person. So the process is very simple. It's arduous free from a client's perspective. There's very, very little they need to do apart from review it and then make any changes. And then once you've got that, you're then good for sales. You can start shipping your product. So really, really, really simple process.
Awesome. Very good.
And that's me, Vincenzo. So I think hopefully that's sort of wrapped up a nice little overview of the label compliance.
You did an amazing job. Thank you so much for the presentation. Even myself, I learned something new, specifically the UK mistake. Like, that's something I didn't know that was happening. So very good to be aware of that. I guess from my side, so I can start making some questions in case nobody from the webinar right now has questions. Is regarding the address, because I get this question a lot on the call. So I'm sure maybe somebody now on the webinar with us may have this question as well, in case they don't ask. Is regarding how you put this address, regarding on where you put it on the packaging, because I know sometimes you have to have this address in the packaging, but people ask which address should be mine in the US, should be my responsible person one, should be my warehouse, like what address you should be putting from a compliance perspective based on your knowledge on that. With the address.
Sure. So a lot of clients obviously want to have often will have their US address on there. You don't need to replace that. You can have multiple addresses on the label. The way that we require our address when we're a responsible person is just your business name and then care of our address. So you don't need to, again, from an aesthetic perspective, it's not going to change anything. You just need to put in its most basic form, but it will be, if you're using Global E-commerce Experts as an example, you'd have our UK address on there, and then you'd have our European address next to it or under it. to satisfy both of those regions. And just to visualize it, it's 3 millimeters is the size of the address that needs to be in your product. So we're not talking about having some, horrific
a postal card.
It doesn't need to be big. And equally, there's different places you can put it as well. So
awesome. So I guess the address in summary would be from the responsible person most of the time, the one you put there, right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Awesome. Very good. Awesome. So yeah, I think that was my main question. I think other than that, you did an amazing job with the presentation. I'm sure some people may have some questions to follow up as they go through the presentation once more after we release the recording and get back to you. So tell us a little bit how people can get in touch and basically get started with global e-commerce experts, because I know this is one of the specialties you guys do. So how people could work with you when it comes to all this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're an end-to-end solution for e-commerce growth in Europe. So, product and label compliance is just one area. But if you'd like to find out more, certainly free consultation. Find me on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code there, or send me an email, however you like. I'm more than happy and delighted to help educate and support you with your expansion. We've got one more thing I wanted to add, Vincenzo. There's been a bit of news within Amazon about
it's always news.
Is that coming? Oh, right, okay, cool. No. Yeah, so they
I was saying that when it comes to Amazon, there's always news, there's always things changing. So I'm just making a joke there.
No worries. Yeah, so they're currently offering responsible person services for CE mark products in Europe, and they started it a little while ago, and they've now ceased that as of the 31st of March 2024. Because, and although I don't have any inside insight, my assumption would be that they haven't got the ability, the resource, or maybe even the knowledge to be able to deal with it when it actually, it's okay to say we can do this, or somebody can say that they can act, but actually being able to do it is another thing. So as part of that, we're offering, if you're in that circle and you've got company using Amazon for responsible person service in Europe, and you'd like to reach out and let us know, we're offering 50% off of our services to ensure that you've got that address in Europe, so you won't have to have your listing stopped come the end of March next year, because as we all know, it's disastrous. So if that's you, or you want to find out more, let me know.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So yeah, amazing promotion. So even myself, I'm going to see if I can use it for some of our clients. So thank you for that. And other than that, I want to thank you for being here on this webinar. The content shared here was amazing. So I appreciate that. And for everybody watching, guys, please reach out to global e-commerce experts. I've been knowing these guys for a long time. They know their stuff, top guys in Europe when it comes to expansion. So yeah, make sure you get your labels right. Okay.
Vincenzo, great to talk to you. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, guys. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. See you in the next one. Have a nice one. Bye-bye.